Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Ethical Conduct of Research Forum. This week, October 28th to November 7th, marks the second annual Academic Integrity Week here at Mississippi State, which means the first one was a true success. The purpose of this special designation for this week is to encourage ethical behavior by conducting educational programs that promote honesty and integrity both inside and outside of the classroom. When most people think of ethics, they think of rules for distinguishing between right and wrong, such as the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, a code of professional conduct like the Hippocratic Oath, first of all, do no harm, a religious creed like the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, or wise sayings like those of Confucius. How these ethics or behavioral norms relate to research is of particular interest to graduate students and faculty. Today, we are very fortunate to have a panel of distinguished faculty to discuss topics related to ethical conduct of research. And I would like to introduce you all to the panel. Dr. John Bickle, you can raise your hand. Dr. John Bickle, Professor and Department Head of Philosophy and Religion. Next, we have Dr. Luigi Gromo, Ralph Powe Research Award winner and Professor Emeritus and Giles Distinguished Professor of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. Next, we have Dr. Newman, Ralph Powe Research Award winner and Giles Distinguished Professor and Endowed Chair of Aerospace Engineering. Next, we have Dr. Daniel Peterson, Ralph Powe Research Award winner, Professor and Director of the Institute for Genomics, Biocomputing, and Biotechnology. And last but not least, we have Dr. Reddy, Ralph Powe Research Award winner and Research Professor of Plant and Soil Sciences. And of course, you have me, myself, I'm Jamal Alexander, a PhD student in mechanical engineering here at Mississippi State, and a proud member of the Graduate Student Association. And I'm proud to serve as your panel member today. We would throw a host of questions to the panel, and we'll open the floor for open discussion from the audience. So to get the ball rolling and to stay on time, I will open up with one of the questions to begin with. So to the panel, do any of you have personal experience either as a student or principal investigator when someone in your lab or research group attempted or committed research misconduct? How was it handled and what was the outcome?
Well, I guess I'll like to start. I've had 45 years of, but first of all, before I start, I want to thank you for showing up in this weather out here, the rain and such, and it's very nice to have you in the audience. Well, as I mentioned, I've worked 45 years in doing research, first for NASA, and the last decade here at Mississippi State. And of course, I ran through all these little situations of these questions that were asked here in misconduct of research. I have a personal experience here. An example, I have 3 co-authors on a proposal. And the first 2 authors provide information to the third author, who actually put the proposal together. And the first author knew the department head at the organization we were sending this proposal to. And so it was sent to the organization. It was awarded. And after it was awarded, it was like a $500,000 award. But after it was awarded, I got a call from the dean's office trying to explain why the first author was on this proposal. I don't know where they came from, whether the second author or someone else in the organization called the dean's office. And of course, that proposal was written with me being first author because I knew the contact person at the organization we were sending a proposal. And so I had to call the dean's office and explain what my contributions were to that proposal. So that's real stabbing someone in the back when they're trying to work together as a group to get a proposal funded by an organization. Of course, the outcome was I no longer work with that organization. So that's the penalty for not doing something like that to a person. So you need to treat your colleagues with respect and really don't treat them that way.
I was once removed from probably the biggest academic fraud scandal that's happened in America over the past decade, and that's the Mark Hauser scandal at Harvard. One of my former graduate students, when I was professor at University of Cincinnati, is actually working in the lab of one of the graduate students who was instrumental in bringing about the knowledge that Harvard gained of the falsification of data and the deliberate misinterpretation of data that Mark Hauser basically resigned from the position in psychology and evolutionary biology at Harvard from. And Mark Hauser is no small potatoes. Mark is probably one of the most prominent researchers in the world up until this scandal, but these graduate students actually, one of these persons of these and two other graduate students, actually took video, actually went back and reanalyzed some videos without Hauser's permission to do so, because they were so concerned that Hauser was making claims about this data set that they thought could not possibly be true. Turned out he was. And so that took a lot of courage on graduate students in his lab to literally do the kinds of things they needed to do in order to bring about the knowledge of this, of what's become probably the biggest scandal of academic falsification of research in the United States over the last decade.
Well, I don't think I can top that one. I knew about the Hauser scandal, but I didn't know that Dr. Bickel, I wouldn't say was involved.
No, I wasn't involved.
Showed,
but I did see the graduate student who...
I do have an experience, and first of all, I'd like to thank you, too, for being here. I think this is one of the best ways, listening to anecdotal information about our experiences and all that, to better understand responsible conduct in research. And so I commend you for being here, particularly with the inclement weather. The experience I had was with a graduate student who was collecting some data. And I work with, aquatic organisms, and they don't know what day it is. And I had a problem with one of my students who didn't like to work on weekends, and particularly on long holiday weekends and all that. And so I was worried about where she was getting the data. And basically I had to set up something to prove to myself that, and she in fact was fabricating data. So I worked with my research associate to set up these traps where we collect crayfish and put something in them to see if they actually had been emptied. And so we did that during the July 4th weekend, and we found out that nothing had been moved for about 3 days. And so when I got the information, the data, obviously, for that July 4th weekend, I got data. And so what I had to do essentially was confront the student, and I was into my second year of a study that was funded by a federal agency. The problem here is simply this. When you have these ethical violations, commonly they're breaches of trust. It's a breach of trust between the graduate student and myself. It's a breach of trust, really, between the graduate student and the funding agency. It didn't take long, following HR procedures, to basically have to get rid of her. And you have to act very promptly. And it's a shame, because I'm thinking about all the other data that was collected the year previously. Is it worthwhile? Is it accurate? And all that? So a project really had to be eliminated, and then you have to talk to the funding agency. So the whole point here is that you're treating it as a breach of trust, and you have to act promptly. And in this case, it's a research misconduct, because it's data fabrication.
Okay. Good evening again. Thanks for having us. And personally, I am a more or less a hands-on person, so I supervise most of my experiments very closely, so that I don't have that conflicts with either students or postdocs that I had over years.
Again, thank you for being here. During my first year here at Mississippi State, I had a student join my lab. very bright fellow who started as a PhD student. And we spent a lot of time together because I had was starting the lab up and I didn't have any other students at the time. And this individual was from another country. Anyway, he's a very bright student and has gone on to great things. But over the course of about 6 months, he started seeing things the way that I did things in the lab, the way that I recorded things, the way that I did such. And one day he asked me to have a conversation with him. And essentially at that time, he revealed to me that the school that he had gone to before, there was a professor at this other school that he had gone to before. I won't mention the name of the school, but it was a very small school. And he'd got his master's degree with this individual. And this individual had come from the same nation that he had come from and told him, essentially, that the only way that he could get ahead in life was to do some fabrication of data. And essentially, this professor asked him to fabricate data on posters. And essentially, there was a genetic linkage map. The student brought me the information, essentially a genetic linkage map that was for one crop, and he took it and he put it on his poster and said this was for another one. So he wanted me to know about this, and the important thing was that I had started a collaboration with this researcher at this other institution. So I contacted my dean and my department head and the people at the USDA that were involved, and we had a big meeting to discuss how we were going to deal with this. What was unfortunate was that this little college that we were dealing with, this fellow brought in lots of money to this college. He didn't ever publish anything, but he was good at getting grants, and they literally went on the attack. Coming after Mississippi State University saying, if you do anything or say anything about this fellow, we're going to be very upset. Ultimately, the resolution at the time was that there would be a kind of essentially a moratorium where no one at Mississippi State would work with this individual. And he ended up leaving the university where he was at. So it was the student that I had, I think he had just never been, he was told this is what he had to do to survive in the U.S. and in U.S. science, and this is what everybody did, and he believed it. And then when he got an opportunity to see that wasn't the way things worked, he was quite upset, but he did the right thing.
Thank you all for those wonderful answers. That brought me to another question. Personally, as a grad student, I know that many of us don't get ethical conduct of research training from our professors when we enter grad school. For me, I know I got the training when I interned at Oak Ridge National Lab for 2 summers. How do you go about training your students to assure that their ethical conduct of research is upheld?
Actually, I assume that the graduate student is ethical and will generate the data in the laboratory from our testing, be valid data. And so I really don't go through any ethical training with the students. And maybe that's something that needs to be changed in the future, you know.
The Department of Philosophy and Religion is making a concerted effort to bring ethical conduct of research and responsible conduct of research to the forefront of graduate education at Mississippi State University. We have developed a 1-hour course, not a huge drain on anybody's time, and a very well done course by a couple of people in our department who specialize in areas of applied ethics like research ethics. We are trying to make it. We're trying to make that course better known to people across campus. And Dr. DeBramo was quite instrumental in letting a number of people and faculty and graduate students know about that course when he was dean of the graduate school, and Dr. Bruce is carrying on with that. And so I think one of the things that we're trying to do in the department, in my department, is to increase our visibility on campus, because we really do have people who are not just people who are just sort of know ethics from a textbook, but have engaged in scientific research and bring to this a philosophical perspective that they've learned from their philosophy training. And it's really an ideal kind of background to talk about some of these issues in a rigorous and informed fashion. So I urge you to take a look at some of the things that we're trying to do in the department, because I think they can be a real help to graduate programs that are strapped for time and for people to teach things like responsible conduct of research.
Well, I think that the way that I deal with it initially with my students is to provide them some information about consequences of violations of ethical conduct, and that not to strike fear in their heart, but to let them know that it's very, very difficult to climb out of that hole once you have been a person who has been found to be a violator of some kind of ethical rule of conduct. I think the other thing that's important too is to allow them to know or enforce the idea that they have a responsibility. Again, it's all based on trust, and they have a responsibility to their fellow researchers, to the public, in terms of providing accurate information. And the accurate information is the basis or the foundation for progress in science. Having opportunities like this, if I had graduate students at this time, obviously they would be here, because these are important ways in which you can, you never learn too much about ethical conduct and responsibility, research responsibility, or conduct in research, I should say, your responsibility in terms of conduct of research. So anytime you have an opportunity like this, under a panel situation, or talking with your peers, or talking with your major professor, very, very important. It's an ongoing thing. It's not a static thing, you know. It's an ongoing thing.
In our department, we, per se, do not have this course or something in that nature for all graduate students to go through or take one course or something like that. However, we, in my lab, where we get most of them are internationals, we do talk with research on the data quality and the implications that they have for funding agencies, or the implication it has on science itself. So when our new student comes, we basically talk through those things so that they will know what is expected from them in conducting the research in a respectable manner.
I'll just be brief. I have run an institute, so I have meetings on usually every 2 weeks with my staff and students and talk about some of these same things. Ethics being a major concern in all of our research. But I also, while I don't teach a formal class on ethics, I teach a class called Topics in Genomics, which deals with topics in genomics. And interestingly, a very large percentage of our discussions end up focused on ethics, because there's all kinds of ethical questions associated with genomics. But also, we end up talking about things like peer review. I mean, last week we had students pick some papers on peer review, and that's what we ended up talking about, problems with peer review. So there's a lot of informal discussion that can occur too, but a lot of it occurs fairly naturally coming out of the different scientific disciplines that you're involved in.
If you have any questions, concerns, or critiques from the audience at this moment in time, we will continue. The next question is, what should a student do if they are feeling pressured by a faculty member or a member of their team to conduct research in ways that are unethical?
Well, that's a difficult situation for the graduate student and also the faculty member, but he should strive to entice the student to do better in his research.
I think the first thing is and this is just is really more of a personal choice than anything else, but the first thing I think graduate students have to do is to confront faculty members or fellow graduate students when they've got a concern. That, and I mentioned, when I mentioned the Hauser scandal and the person I know that's involved with that takes an awful lot of courage. But it's something, I think it's a particular character virtue that I think is absolutely crucial. When you see something that doesn't look right, you need to talk to the lab supervisor about it not looking right and explain what your concerns are. That's the first step. That may be the step that resolves it, but that, I think, is the first step. Sometimes it's the hardest step because you are bringing up a problem to a person in authority. But there's a certain amount of personal courage that it takes to be a scientist or an academic in this day and age, and there's no getting around that.
I think a very important facet in terms of what a student should do is hopefully the student has established a very good working relationship with his or her major professor. And if there is something that brings concern in terms of how the data is being handled or collected, I think that if there is a lab supervisor, then obviously that would be the person to talk to. If there is no lab supervisor, then I think you have to have the courage to go to your major professor and not do it in any kind of adversarial way, but do it in a way in which you're seeking clarification. And if that discussion with the major professor is not sufficient to satisfy your concern, then you really have to go probably to the department head and explain the situation. And again, this takes courage because obviously you're concerned about your graduate studies and what effect this might have and whether the major professor is vindictive and all that. But it's very, very important, I think, that you go and you do it promptly and go through the proper order, if you will, in terms of discussing this. And you may even want to discuss it with one of your peers first in terms of how you go to the lab supervisor or to the department head. But obviously, if you have a concern, and I know how difficult it is because you're also thinking about retribution and something that's not positive, probably negative, but it's important that you do this.
This one is a little more difficult for many students to see it. One of them is, in order to see something is wrong in the department, in the other guy's work, you have to know something, the whole project. So you have to be a little bit more careful and not a casual statement, something like a casual, oh, he's doing something wrong. And you have to know a little bit in depth about the knowledge about the subject, what the other student is doing. Then only you can confront and then maybe talk with your advisor, something like that. If it is not resolved at the advisor level, probably, as Lou said, you can talk with the head of the department or beyond to if it is a genuine case. But at front, you have to know that in depth about the other project, what the other student is doing. Without that, you cannot superficially judge and then go and say something about it.
Dr. Reddy's correct. It is very difficult. If you're a department head or you've dealt with a lot of people in departments, you often get the two people coming to you, one claiming the other one's unethical. And you have to kind of go through what's going on. And sometimes you're not really dealing with what I would perceive as an ethical problem. It's just a communication problem, or sometimes people have different concepts of what is ethical and what is not ethical. And sometimes it's not so easy to be in the middle of that. But what I would say is that if it's someone in the lab that you're working with, you definitely want to go to the head of the lab and talk with them. But as I mentioned before, I had a student whose major professor was essentially conducting doing unethical things. That gets trickier, but the department heads are trained and experienced in having to deal with this, and they have to deal with it. And it's an important thing for them. And it's pretty scary to go and talk with the department heads, but they do understand. And believe me, they would much rather catch something like this and deal with it early on than have it fester. And I guess, and I would ask Dr. Abramo's advice, but I suppose if one of the things that you're concerned about, you could probably go to the graduate school. Would that be a place to turn? Mm-hmm. To just ask questions about something like this, and they might be able to advise you there as well.
Yes, I think communication, again, is essential, and prompt communication is essential, because there are many ways, there can be misconceptions, and the way people interpret, have different ways of interpreting things. So just letting it sit there and fester, and you're going to say to yourself, "No, I don't want to do this. It's going to take too much time. I'm trying to get out of here," and all that. In the long run, that is not going to help you.
Let me make one more point, Jamal, as well. And all excellent points that people have made here, but there's one more resource that Mississippi State has made available, and my department's been involved with this resource, and that's the Anonymous Ethics Hotline. It exists at this university. You can report anything that you find questionable in an anonymous setting that will be considered by a person who is a specialist in research ethics, and that person can then decide whether or not there's something that might require further consideration. That resource is here at this university now. It is operable at this university now, and it is there to be used in case you see something that you just don't think looks right.
And I obviously have been involved in some of those, conducting those investigations, and I have obviously been, believe it or not, a subject of an investigation too. So people don't agree with the way I maybe have done something. They think it's an ethical violation. They report it to Ethics Point, and they certainly can do that, and then an investigation ensues if they think that there's enough information there that would warrant an investigation. And it's very, very comprehensive.
Thank you all. Do you want to have any questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
As far as unethical research being conducted, where we are now compared to 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, have it gotten better or worse?
Well, I'll try that.
Sure,
one.
sure.
I think it's gotten much better, and the reason for that, I think, is that many societies now have publications on ethical standards of conduct, and there are more discussions at professional meetings regarding standards of conduct, ethics. And again, the whole idea of bringing it forward for communication, for discussion, is very, very important. A lot of publications now, a lot of them that are directly related to particular disciplines, because, different disciplines, different interpretations, and what is correct, what isn't correct in terms of conduct. There are standards, obviously, but you're tweaking things depending upon the discipline. So I would say that much more so now, and of course our peer review process on proposals and on manuscripts and things like that are much better. I don't know, my colleagues may have something else to say.
Thanks.
Yes, sir. When something like this happens, is it something that remains at the university level for dealing with, or is it something that can spill over into the civilian authority as far as law enforcement having to deal with it?
It depends on the violation, but yeah, think about, just to take the Hauser scandal, for example, think about how closed-mouth Harvard has been about what exactly happened. I mean, they have not released any specific evidence for which Mark Hauser was accused, and the basis of his resignation. And they even made they did not fire him. He resigned. But these things can have, depending on the violation, they can have fall over into civilian law, extra university law enforcement. The mention of earlier about when you get federal granting agencies involved, these can have all kinds of repercussions at the level of civil and increasing criminal activity. I mean, you know this case in California, I'm sure, of this chemist who is on trial for negligent death of one of the researchers in his lab.
And you would be naive not to believe that there are professors here on this campus, research associates and all that have committed violations, serious violations of ethical conduct that have either had to resign or that they had significant, I want to put it like, things that they had to do in order to allow the Office of Research and Economic Development to accept what they had done in return for the ethical violation. So, not really describing that very well, but obviously this goes on at this university, believe me. Okay? Now you may not hear about it, and a lot of this is precipitated by funding agencies like NSF. We've just found something out about one of your professors who's plagiarized, and we want you to conduct an investigation. And the investigation, believe you me, is conducted.
Thank you all for those wonderful answers. We have a case study brought to us by the Graduate Student Association, although this is not Sesame Street. Bert is collaborating with Ernie on a research paper that will be a chapter in Bert's dissertation. How should Ernie's contribution to Bert's work, Bert is collaborating with Ernie on a research paper that will be in a chapter of Bert's dissertation. How should Ernie's contribution be acknowledged in Bert's dissertation? Can the work also be a chapter in Ernie's dissertation as well?
Please.
Okay. Well, this happens quite often when you have colleagues, and a colleague may come up with an idea or approach or theory, that helps someone else's thesis, and we normally reference that person inside the thesis with his name and organization. And in this case here, if Ernie's dissertation comes out first, then he maybe can reference the thesis of Bert's. So need to work together and acknowledge the contributions of each of those in their work dissertations.
I don't have an easy answer to this question by any means. It's a very good question. And of course, what's going to matter in cases like this are going to be the exact details of the collaboration, the exact details of the data gathered, who owns the data. All those kinds of questions are going to have to be answered and by the details of the particular case. But I will make one remark, and that is that the increasingly interdisciplinary nature of science, of particular sciences, have made cases like this even more difficult and more prominent over the last 20 or 30 years than they probably were 20 or 30 years ago. And so I think what you have to look at in cases like this is you have to look exactly at the specific details involved to make a judgment. I don't think you're going to be able to find some abstract rule that's going to cover all cases.
I agree. I'll be short on this one. I think what's important here is what is the nature of the collaboration, and also the importance of acknowledgement, depending upon which one comes out first. If they're using the same chapter, written the same way, then obviously that's plagiarism. And again, that has to be worked out. That has to be worked out. Okay.
I think this is a tough question on how to use it. But personally, I normally have a meeting with, I have several graduate students. If the first thing I will say is it's not going to be community PhDs. a community dissertation. It has to be individual. That's the first thing. We do have some collaborative work. They can work outside their dissertation, that they can work together. That is the second rule that I normally specify upfront in the beginning. In that case, the sharing of this information will not come into that picture. It's not going to be a community-based PhD program. It's an individual-based PhD, it's an individual-based program. Our master's is also a similar way. There won't be any two people working together for one PhD, or one PhD data can be used for getting two PhDs or two masters. So that's, I specifically mention to all my graduate students, whenever they come in, this is the set rules that we follow.
I come from an area of research in which sometimes you have publications with 100 authors on them. And these are generally things like genome sequences of cotton was one of the recent ones that came out. And it makes it very difficult because generally when you think about a paper being written, ultimately one person is probably responsible for a big part of that. And then other people add little things to that. So ultimately, you have to be pretty, you're a major professor and you have to have a pretty good relationship of what your contributions are, what you're expected to write. That doesn't mean that some of the stuff that goes into, say, a big paper can't be utilized in your dissertation. But these again, are discussions that you need to have with your thesis or your dissertation advisor. Now, just by the nature of the research, with lots and lots of people involved, it is a very political thing. We had a paper, the paper on cotton, come out, and it came out in Nature in the last year. And it was funny because after that, I started having my students start arguing about what their position was going to be on the next paper in terms of first author or second author, and there wasn't any papers written. And I had to kind of pull them back into line and say, wait a second, you can divide up the spoils when you've got something to divide up, but ultimately writing the paper is the hardest, really one of the, maybe the hardest part. I think also that leads kind of into a segue on plagiarism, and that's simply that the most common type of ethical violation I see is plagiarism. And we see it a lot. And I've reviewed a lot of papers, and I very quickly identified sections that were lifted from other things. And it's not always, you have to be very careful with these kind of things, because a lot of times the major advisors have got huge things going on. They haven't read everything, they haven't cross-checked everything against the different browsers or so on. So you have to be pretty politically sensitive when you deal with that. But that is one of the most common things that I see.
Yeah, I got a little anecdote that I think is, and this happened here at the university many, many years ago. And it was a professor in a particular department who had been reading a proposal as a reviewer for a particular funding agency, and read it, and then saw a little area there that was very, very interesting. Obviously, he was reviewing it because he was familiar with the discipline, but found something that the individual was doing that was very interesting. And so he did the review and all that, and then wrote up a proposal, and actually plagiarized and took a part of the proposal that he reviewed and put it into his proposal. Well, guess who reviewed his proposal? And so when that was brought to the reviewer's attention, when he saw that it had been plagiarized from his proposal, then NSF contacted Mississippi State, and then the investigation ensued.
Thank you so much. Any questions from the audience at this time? Well, Dr. Peterson, you brought up an interesting case about authorship on manuscripts. What criteria should be used to determine authorship on a manuscript in preparation for submission to publication?
That's right.
Oh, you said,
no,
please go ahead.
I want to see what everybody else says. No, seriously. I think and this may be a little bit nebulous in a sense, but if a person has made a substantial intellectual contribution to the research that was done, then that particular individual should be an author. You know, there are a lot of other ways in which you see a lot of people with, you see manuscripts that have a number of authors, and you know, a sequence has to be developed. And generally, I would recommend that that sequence be developed prior to when the research is going to be done, based upon the relative contributions of the individuals. But if they are making a substantial contribution, intellectual contribution, then obviously they should be considered. And we have a number of examples of people that are, you know, like gift authors, because, you know, if you put me on your paper, I'll put you on my paper, or honorary, or respect. Because if you put somebody's name on a paper, and a well-known individual, then that particular paper may have a better chance of being accepted. But it's important for me, if I include somebody on the author as an author on a paper, that they've made a contribution, a substantial intellectual contribution, and they are able to defend and explain the content of that paper, which I think is very important.
Well, being at a university, that we run into that situation all the time with graduate students. The graduate student is doing the work and writing the paper, but a lot of my students are foreign, and they don't have a Master of English, and so I do a lot of rewriting of the report, and they'll still be first author. But if we publish, you know, several articles, several different works, sometimes I'm the first author because I spend a lot of time rewriting papers. My past experience at NASA Langley, I had a colleague that we were equal in status. He was doing the final element work, and I was doing the experimental work, and we jointly put together the papers. And when the paper's only on the analysis, you know, Raj, you would be the first author, and if it's on experiments, I would be the first author.
Yeah, look, these are difficult issues, and I think both points that Jim and Lou made that need to be worked out in some degree, with some degree of explicit communication and understanding. I've had a number of co-authored papers. When I was part of a graduate program, when I was running a graduate program, I would routinely publish papers with my graduate students, and sometimes, you know, I was making what amounted to a choice on their basis as to whether they were first author or I was first author. I mean, we might have both contributed equally to it, or maybe even I even contributed a little bit more. But it would be better for that particular person to be the first author than me on that particular manuscript, and so those kinds of things feature in these kinds of decisions. Again, it's not the kind of thing I think you're going to find an algorithm for solving. You're going to need to know about the specific details of the particular case and try to make a reasonable judgment based on the particular case. But the last point that Dr. DeBramo made, and thinking the point he made is right on. When you're determining if someone's going to be an author on a paper, and they could not explain to me what we did in that paper, I'd be reluctant to put them on as an author, even if they did a crucial piece of an experiment, or even if they did a crucial piece of the work that became part of that particular paper. If they can't give at least a good kind of synopsis of what we did in the paper, it's difficult to think of them as an author of that paper.
Any questions from the audience?
Exactly. I just wanted to comment on it, but most of the PhD level graduate students, normally it is their work, then they own the work, and as an advisor also part of that one, they both own the work. So in my case, we normally, they are the first senior authors on those things. And for a collaborative work that we work with other scientists, there are several ways of it comes in that one. We just finished one with 15 authors. It's a review paper. The first person who contributed, put together the team and then contributed is the senior author. The rest of them, they put in alphabetical order. So there are several ways of doing things based on the situation.
I've got a quick thing to add, if that's okay. No, sorry. One of the things that you definitely need to be aware of is there is no one system. And that you can inadvertently alienate people. And I've done this. When I was a graduate student, my PhD advisor, there's something on if you've published any papers, there's usually the first author, and then there's often someone that's a corresponding author. And I asked my PhD advisor, I said, who should be corresponding author? And his response to me was, well, you should be corresponding author unless you have some reason not to be. And so I said, okay, and I put myself down as corresponding author. Well, I went on to do my postdoc in a very big laboratory, and I got my paper written, and I just put myself down as a corresponding author and submitted it, and it ended up being a very good paper. I found out sometime later in a discussion with my postdoc advisor that really hurt his feelings, because from where he came from, you let the senior member of the lab be the corresponding author. So it was funny because I could understand both sides, but I did not realize that I had hurt his feelings, and he was wondering why I was being unethical in this sense. And not unethical, but he thought I was trying to run over him. And you know, the good thing is it's now 20 years later and we're still working together. So we worked it out pretty well. But just be aware that it is not simple. And it does take, especially if you've got lots of authors, it does take some work and some negotiation, and it won't be perfect.
And a word of advice, if you haven't worked out what would be the sequence in terms of authorship with your major professor, you better do it now. And do it before you start your research, so you have an understanding of what the expectations are of your major professor and where you're going to be in terms of authorship, in terms of what your responsibilities are to be a first author or something like that. So if you haven't done that, you're going to have a surprise probably, and you don't need to have those surprises. Work it out promptly and as quickly as possible.
So I know that many of you are reviewers for journal articles. How does a journal assure that ethical conduct of research has been upheld in the papers it publishes?
I guess it's my turn. The major journals have peer review processes where peer colleagues out there at different universities and industries review your paper. Normally they have 2 or 3 reviewers of the paper to go through and make sure your theories are correct, your data looks valid, and also sometimes when I receive papers from China, and I go through and make some of the English corrections to the paper, but then also maybe suggest that someone else in their country, who's fluent in English, rewrite the paper or help the student rewrite the paper.
Yeah, no, exactly right. I mean, the journals, at least all the ones that I've been involved with on the editorial board or that I do peer review for, as far as I can tell, basically rely on peer review to catch instances of plagiarism or misconduct of research. It's certainly not a perfect process, but that's about the only one that I know of that's really operative in the day-to-day operations of journal activities, journal editors.
I think that, again, assurance really comes down to, insurance is only as good, really, as the integrity of the reviewer himself or herself. We get reviews sometimes, being an associate editor of a journal right now, we get reviews that are just like a paragraph. And you wonder, well, did this person really take the time and really objectively review the information, the product of the research that is in the manuscript? And it's very, very important because, again, you have a responsibility as a reviewer, and you could violate, I should say, ethics in a sense of not doing what you said you're going to do. It's your responsibility, and it becomes a breach of trust not only to the person who submitted the manuscript, but a breach of trust to everyone in that discipline. it can cause science to regress rather than progress.
There was a paper that came out in Science just recently where some gentleman wrote a bogus paper with a lot of illogical conclusions and so on, and submitted it, and he got at this point, I mean, the fellow submitted only to open access journals, and there was a lot of controversy about that, but essentially there was a huge acceptance rate of this paper, and it was whatever it was, it was evidence that there were certain journals out there, and actually there's a list of them that was produced that may not actually be peer-reviewed journals that are claiming to be peer-reviewed journals. You need to do a little bit of homework on the journals that you're looking at. How long have they been around? Do they have someone that's actually listed as an editor on there? Does that person is there actually a street address associated with the journal? Because one of the things that this finding came out with is there's a lot of journals called, like, the American Journal of X, that is, when they start tracing back where the web connections were, you know, Sri Lanka or someplace like that, and it's being run, and essentially people that submit their papers there are because you have to pay essentially to get your stuff published in most cases. Mm-hmm. They're not being sent out for serious review. They're just taking the money. They may suggest that you put it this way or that way, and they'll post them up there. But you need to think about where you're going to submit, because there are charlatans out there. There are people that will take your money and give you something that's essentially worthless, which is a peer-reviewed paper that's not really peer-reviewed.
And we can talk about ideals, and the system is not foolproof. I mean, there are articles that have been published in the past in Science and in Nature that they have found after they'd gone through the review process and actually have been published, that people have not been able to reproduce the results that have been reported. And the reason for that is either the data has been fabricated or falsified. But sometimes the name on the paper, people don't take the time to really give it a comprehensive, thorough review. This person is an eminent scientist, and they don't give it the time. And it does get into Nature. It does get into Science.
Yeah, and one of the things I would say about Nature and Science in particular is while they're very highly respected journals, they also are magazines, and they do like readership. And so they will publish things that are often very controversial. My only paper that I've ever got in Science was a paper that was essentially a response saying, this article that you published is nonsense, and I presented an extremely nice argument for it, and it got a paragraph in the actual written thing with an online thing, and it counted as a science paper, but it was kind of a shame because the paper should never have been published. But it's not a perfect system, but I failed to find anyone that has a replacement system. And that's the big thing, is that while it's not perfect, it does do a fairly good job.
Do we have any questions or comments at this point? Al?
I've been chewing on the topic of plagiarism, and what comes to my mind is there a distinction that's made between blatant plagiarism and unintentional plagiarism?
Not that I mean, you can imagine that distinction being made just kind of anecdotally, but not that I know of as a sort of well worked out with criteria for application. I'm not aware of any successful attempt to do that. So usually with plagiarism, it just goes back to the point of just simply co-opting someone else's intellectual work without properly referencing it. And intention really doesn't matter. You know, it's plagiarism if it meets that condition. And of course, we can always draw sort of degrees of responsibility, degrees of the kind of bad bad character of the agent involved. But plagiarism seems to be being treated right now in academic circles and in other circles with regard to just simply, was that somebody else's work that someone co-opted without proper citation?
Yeah, I think I'm a hardliner on this one. I agree with Dr. Bickel because plagiarism is plagiarism, and it's I'll use the example of either you're pregnant, you can't just be half pregnant, you know, and so it's the same kind of example here. Plagiarism is plagiarism, and not unintentional plagiarism. I don't see that myself. Again, these are issues and topics for discussion, and people have claimed, even here at this university, that the plagiarism was unintended. And I sat in on a table where the professor said that he had been under medication, and he didn't realize that he had used word for word and plagiarized. So. Plagiarism is plagiarism. That's my feeling.
With the explosion of these open access journals now, you can see the much more of that nature that is appearing in those journals. I have seen one article that is being referred to me as a reviewer. He submitted the same article for 5 different continents, but it came from 5 different continents, but ultimately it was published in 5 different journals. It is happening. It's because of the explosion of these journals. It's been published in quite a bit reputed journals. So when you look at it, all of them are open access. Now you can see that. You can see that same data being utilized in 5 different publications, and you can judge yourself whether the quality of the work or the quality of the person's work. They are open now. It's in earlier days it was pretty hard to get into the actual journal article, but now it is open. Even though those open access journals, they are publishing open. It's open, so everybody can see it. But you can judge the quality of the work, quality of the persons very easily now, even though he does something that's not ethical.
I think it was yesterday one of my students sent me we were discussing a movie actually called Gattaca, and they sent me a link with Rand Paul, who's a politician, essentially reading, giving a speech that was lifted essentially from a Google or a Wikipedia site on that. Now, I imagine someone else prepared that speech for him, and they are probably fired. But one of the things that is difficult, especially if you've got articles with lots of people involved in them, is, and this is something that I've dealt with, when I've got papers from large groups, and I start reading something, and I said, this sounds familiar. And I start looking around, and I find that somebody lifted a paragraph or 2 paragraphs directly out of another source. And you have to be careful, because I don't think it was likely in this case that the senior authors probably realized that there was plagiarism. They just saw it, and but ultimately in some ways they're responsible for it. So what I essentially did at that time was I contacted the editor, and I said, I can't accept this paper because it's got plagiarism, and I'd like this pointed out to the senior investigators and let them discuss it with the junior investigators, and then they can resubmit it. And that's what they chose to do. But it's a good idea if you've got students that are working for you and they've written something. it's a good idea to check it against all the tools that they have nowadays, because you don't want something that's plagiarized going into a paper of yours.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the panel for coming out today and giving us great advice on ethics. Do anybody in the audience have any questions or concerns? Yes, sir.
Given the graduate school pushes the TAs to take a TA workshop before the semester starts, why can't we do the same for RAs coming into the program that would have a two-day workshop on ethics before they start?
Want me to answer that? I'd say that's a great idea, because I had that idea. And that may come about in the future. I thought I could get that working before I retired. Believe it or not, with all due respect, there's a lot of resistance from faculty, because they're just saying this is another thing that the graduate school is imposing on us. So, and I'm telling you the truth, and it's easy to tell the truth when you're retired. But that was on my mind back in probably 2010, and I thought that I could get that through. It takes a lot of work to organize it. It takes a lot of work to organize the TA workshop. But I got a lot of resistance from faculty, because you certainly want to throw it out to faculty and say, this is what we're planning to do. What do you think about this and all that? And I think that, sometimes there's this resistance because they feel like, you're shoving something else down their throat. But we feel certainly that this is important. And with some of the work that we've been doing with Dr. Bickle, I think that there'll be opportunities for students to, and he can probably elaborate on this more now since I've been gone for a few months, that there'll be opportunities for students to, if you will, take some kind of workshop or some kind of course, as he had mentioned, these 8,000 courses, 1 credit, 8,000 courses, to pass a requirement to have had some kind of ethics education. And that's complemented certainly by individual departments who may have seminars on it and all that. Like I said, it's not a static thing. Understanding ethics is a very dynamic thing. You should be communicating all the time. It's very, very important.
Let me add to that. Let me add to that too. That one of the worries, and it's a very legitimate worry, that practicing scientists have when these kinds of proposals are made is that, oh, well, you're just going to get some philosopher up there telling me about Kant or telling me about Aristotle or something. And look, that's a legitimate worry, because that would be a waste of time for many people and for many practicing scientists. That's why one of the things that we're doing in the philosophy department is we are building a group of people who have real scientific background as well as their training in philosophy. I ran a graduate program, a PhD program at the University of Cincinnati that's nationally prominent in philosophy and the sciences. And I've come down here, and one of my first objectives is to bring into this university fellow philosophers who have a background in some science. I have a background in neuroscience. My undergraduate degree is in neuroscience, and I did 3 years of graduate work in neuroscience before I decided to go on and finish in philosophy of science. So one of the things that we're going to try our hardest to combat is the idea that, oh, they just want our graduate students to sit up there and hear some philosopher yammer on, for an hour about abstract problems in ethics. I can promise you that will not be what you'll hear from my department.
I'm just curious if you think part of that resistance is also the fact that most of these sort of violations happen in a very behind closed doors things. I'm not saying that we should put people out in the stocks and publicly embarrass them, but is this resistance on some level related to the fact that people might be thinking that this doesn't happen here because they don't hear it, they don't see it, people just sort of are denying it? I mean, could that be part of it? I mean, you just don't hear about, unless you come to one of these, you hear, and you get people's personal stories, you don't really hear about these things. Other than the sensationalized big
Exactly,
laws,
exactly,
right?
yeah.
But there's all sorts of small potatoes violations that are going on at our university.
Ask yourself what the value of that is, though.
Yeah.
Bring it to the forefront, and what's the value?
Well, I'm not saying that we need to pillory people or do any of that. What I am saying is that maybe some idea that these things do what is the value in this training for faculty is that these things happen and let's avoid it. We need to be advocates.
Not only that these things happen, but the consequences could be substantial.
Yeah.
Even in the case of one recently before I finished, before I retired, let's put it that way, where a PhD, later on, they found out that there was some plagiarism after the PhD had been granted. And ultimately, the PhD was revoked because of the plagiarism.
Let's see, I was going to say something, but let me think one more time.
Sorry.
What was the question again, by the way?
About putting out in front.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. One of the things that with information being just so quickly transmitted anymore, there are little, little subscription services that are just free where they send you little articles about, whatever in your field. And every day I get probably 3 or 4 of these in my mailbox, and I'll take a quick look at them. And almost every day there's at least one article about somebody's being exposed for plagiarism or for some act of unethical behavior. And this isn't just becoming, it is getting around, and it is getting spread around very quickly. And sometimes I would say it may actually get spread around quicker than it should. Because, as you know, sometimes people get tried in the press before they ever have a chance to even defend themselves. But there are, if you look at it, you start getting pretty weary that, oh man, this is happening all the time. But it's like watching CNN all the time or watching whatever. And newscasts all the time, is everything in the world is channeled right through that, and you see just all the awful things going on, and you kind of think that that's the way it is. Most researchers are very, very ethical as far as I can tell. I mean, that's one of the things that we have. I mean, I've said this to my students, and I don't mean it directly, but I mean, you can cheat on your wife, you can cheat on your taxes, you can do this and that, but if you lie about your research, you will lose your credibility is gone forever. So, most people are very, I mean, they may have other things going on, but they are very good about it. But there are incidences of it happen, and they are showing up, and there is a whole network of things out there where people are pointing it out.
I just don't want people to think that I think people need to be publicly shamed. That's not what I was trying to say.
No, exactly.
Details need to go out, but I'm wondering if there's sort of a culture of denial of this doesn't happen, so we don't need to worry about it. But
So
I don't. Okay.
we have come to the conclusion on time. I'm pretty sure you can speak with any one of these